would it be better to just use WebAssembly? I think the best thing that's happened for the web has been the fact that there's been one primary language, because it's forced people with a whole bunch of different perspectives to come together and try to create things that we can all use together and that we can all inspect in the browser, in view source. And as soon as you fragment that again, I mean, the classic thing about things in tech or in anything is they get big, they gain adoption, and when they get too big, they get split apart again because people start to disagree and it becomes too big to have a consistent community around it. And that's the risk, right? That's why you see things like Elm and Dart and other approaches that really try to fork from JavaScript, as well as other languages and the whole WebAssembly thing. But I would argue that WebAssembly is kind of off the mark in that I want things I can actually understand and inspect and use universally. And WebAssembly kind of says, we're punting, we're giving up. At this point, I just have to write C code, or I just have to write Java code, or I just have to write Python code. And that, to me, that's not the approach we should really go as a community. But I think the community will kind of decide that for itself. I don't think I can force the community to say, no, this is a bad idea.
Well, one of those directions that JavaScript kept being pulled in for years and years and years, and I think to its benefit, by the way, I'm glad that JavaScript has been strained in the area of performance, because we have seen the entire browser performance wars waged over the last 5 to 8 years, and JavaScript is orders of magnitude better at performing than it used to be, and I think that's one of the reasons why the language can really be taken seriously in the long term now, is because of that. But that's one of the directions that kept getting pulled, and I think somewhere along the way the narrative changed from I would like this to be more on par with other systems to I don't want to treat JavaScript as a language that I write in. I want to treat it as a platform that I target for delivery. And I think that's where we moved from JavaScript being a language to JavaScript being some piece of the stack that potentially developers are not even thinking about anymore. Just like we probably don't think about the assembly language very much in most of the programming, that part is already just kind of buried below many stacks of abstraction and so forth. And that, to me, is what troubles me about the WebAssembly movement, is when we prioritize the web as a platform and JavaScript as that engine of the platform, when we prioritize that performance story over the authorship story, and I don't just mean the writing of the code, but I mean the learning of code. That view source is the way that many generations of people got to code. And yes, view source will still be here when we are in the WebAssembly of the future, when the application has very little authored JavaScript and things are running other languages. But that story is going to be radically different than it used to be. Instead of view source and seeing one code base in JavaScript, you may view source and see 9 different languages, or languages that you've never even heard of before, because the authors chose to prioritize something about the writing of the code and not prioritize the reading and the viewing and the authorship side. So that's the troubling part that I have.
Absolutely. That's completely troubling to me as well, because it really, if we think interoperability is bad now, just wait for that world to come. And one of the things that I like about JavaScript is, a few years ago they came out with this thing called strict mode, which was nice to basically say, don't do this subset of things because it makes the JavaScript engines run slower. So why not try to get more people thinking about that? Why not say, hey, instead of having to look for another language, let's continue to find ways to say, this particular approach in JavaScript is slow or is not recommended anymore. Let's not use that. And similarly, if we're adding all these features to the language, we better make sure those new features are fast. Otherwise, we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. And, so that's actually an interesting thing TypeScript does as well. They have a strict mode. And their strict mode is around making the TypeScript compiler faster. So basically saying, if I'm strict, I follow these set of rules that I have to do to define my types and my interfaces and whatnot. And if I don't do them, the compiler can still work. It's just going to take a little longer to compile from TypeScript to plain JavaScript. And so the benefit is if you go through the effort to follow the strictness, the compiler can run faster. And to me, that's a good trade-off, right? And it's one of the things we do in Dojo is we follow strict mode to the end. And in fact, the irony is like right now, even TypeScript itself isn't fully strict yet because it's actually really hard to do for certain scenarios. But again, like if you can say, look, let's make the performance fast with the tool we're using by pointing out the things that make it slow and making it, fairly easy to figure that out. Isn't that better than saying, hey, let's go switch to another language? Now, there are certain things that JavaScript is not good or not fast enough at. Probably the biggest one is like huge numerical computation. So it's probably not a great language today for things like machine learning or, true 3D game engines or things like that. But those scenarios are relatively small. So let's limit the WebAssembly approach for those use cases, but not just for, hey, I'm building a web app, but I happen to know Python. So I'm going to use Python to describe, the code that modifies my markup. That to me just seems kind of silly.
Well, our community has a long history of cargo culting. Once we see Facebook do it or we see Google do it, it means that all the rest of us are supposed to follow suit and do it exactly the way they do. So I'm sure in some future, not too far away, we're going to see Facebook writing blog posts and doing conference talks about how they've moved 90% of their code base into Rust and they compiled
or ReasonML or whatever. Yeah, exactly.
Right. And then we'll see an entire generation of developers who say, well, that's the way we must go because my little blog certainly has exactly the same user and performance characteristics as Facebook.com.
Yeah, I mean, we as a history of a community have this problem and that will never be fixed, unfortunately. But all we can do is do our best.